All right, so we're back for another deep dive, and today we're going to be looking at the Kaylee Mandotti case. I think this is a case that a lot of true crime fans are going to be pretty familiar with. But today we're going to be looking specifically at an episode of a true crime podcast that really dives into this case. And I think it's going to be a fascinating look at the trials of Mark Houghton, the just crazy twists and turns that this case takes, and then also the kind of remarkable role that Kaylee's parents played in seeking justice for their daughter.
Hmm.
It's just hard to imagine losing a child and then having to investigate their death yourself.
Hmm.
And that's exactly what Kaylee's parents had to face.
Yeah, it really highlights the challenges when you've got these conflicting narratives, you've got limited physical evidence, and then just a web of relationships that complicate the picture. It's hard to piece together what really happened.
Absolutely. So let's start by setting the stage a little bit. So Kaylee Mandotti was a 19-year-old college student at Trinity University in San Antonio. She was a cheerleader. She was in a sorority, just a young woman full of life. And she was dating two men at the time, Jet Birch, who was a football player, and Mark Houghton, who was a former high school baseball star.
Yeah, and it's this sort of love triangle that ends up being so crucial to the story. The relationship between Kaylee and Houghton was by many accounts troubled. There were reports of Houghton being jealous, exhibiting controlling behavior. There was even an incident where he reportedly threw her against a wall. And it actually escalated to the point where he was barred from the university campus for damaging some of her belongings.
Oh, wow. So there's already this history of conflict in the relationship. And to make matters even more complicated, Kaylee had even confided in friends that she actually wanted to break up with Houghton.
Yeah, that just adds another layer of complexity to this already intricate case.
Right, so let's fast forward a little bit to October 29th, 2017. Kaylee and Houghton attended the Maluna Music Festival together. They were both using MDMA and alcohol that night. And to make things even more complicated, while they were at the festival, they actually ran into Jet.
Oh, wow. So talk about a recipe for a very dramatic encounter.
Yeah, I'm sure that didn't go well.
It did not know. It led to an argument between Kaylee and Houghton and kind of added fuel to the fire of their already very strained relationship.
Right, so we've got this volatile mix of emotions going on. You've got substances involved, and you've got this love triangle. What happens next?
So later that night, Houghton ends up rushing Kaylee to a rural hospital in Luling, Texas. She was unresponsive, she had no pulse, and when the EMTs got there, she was covered in bruises. And even worse than that, she was partially unclothed.
Oh my gosh, so I can't imagine the just alarm bells that must have been going off for the medical staff seeing that.
Yeah.
So you've got the situation where there are these initial assumptions being made. Was this a drug overdose or was there something more sinister going on?
Exactly. And while they were, the police are interviewing Houghton, he's claiming that they left the festival after the argument about Jet. They stopped and had what he called makeup sex. And then Kaylee started feeling unwell and eventually just passed out. But the EMTs who are treating her, they're immediately noticing the bruising. They're noticing that she's not dressed, and it's raising some red flags that really can't be ignored.
Right, so you have these conflicting accounts right from the start. You have these unanswered questions. And then 3 months later, the autopsy report comes back.
And that becomes a major turning point in the case, because the autopsy indicated that blunt force trauma to the face and head was the actual cause of death. And so it really shifted the investigation's focus and ultimately led to Houghton's arrest for Kaylee's murder.
Wow, what a bombshell. So what was the defense's response to that?
So the defense, they argued that Houghton cooperated with the police, he allowed searches, and they were saying that there were no eyewitnesses to any kind of assault. So that became the foundation of their strategy as the first trial approached.
Right, so we've got this stage set for this legal battle, these high stakes and conflicting narratives. Let's dive into that first trial a little bit. So what were the key arguments that the prosecution presented?
So the prosecution, they really built their case around the physical evidence of Kaylee's injuries. The paramedics' testimonies about her condition when she arrived at the hospital, and then also the testimonies of friends who shed light on the kind of turbulent nature of the relationship between Kaylee and Houghton.
Right, so they're trying to connect the events of that night with this pattern of abuse. And I remember reading, too, that Jet's testimony was actually pretty crucial as well. I mean, he was the one who saw them at the festival and witnessed Houghton pulling Kaylee away.
Yeah, Jet's testimony becomes a really significant piece of this puzzle. He described, the encounter, he described Houghton's behavior, and it seemed to corroborate what the prosecution was presenting. But the defense, they countered by attacking Jet's credibility. They were highlighting inconsistencies in his statements and pointing to the fact that he actually invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination several times on the stand.
Ah, so they're trying to just poke holes in his story and cast doubt on him as a witness.
Exactly.
Makes sense. What other strategies did the defense use to counter the prosecution's case?
So they brought in a medical expert, Dr. Anderson, and he offered some alternative explanations for Kaylee's injuries. He suggested possibilities like complications from CPR.
Yeah.
He even talked about organ donation and a potential skull fracture from like an accidental fall.
So now the jury has to weigh these like drastically different narratives, right?
Hmm.
And they have to try to determine what really happened that night. I mean, it must have been so difficult to sift through all that information and come to a unanimous decision.
Yeah.
What was the outcome of this first trial?
So the jury was actually deadlocked. They couldn't come to a unanimous decision, so it was a mistrial.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it just left Kaylee's family, her friends, in this state of just agonizing uncertainty.
I can only imagine, I mean, talk about frustration and just heartbreak.
Hmm.
You know, the justices that they were seeking just seems to slip away. It's really no surprise that they decided to take matters into their own hands at this point.
Yeah.
What was it that really drove them to become investigators
Oh,
themselves?
I think it was this unwavering belief that there was something that had been overlooked, something in their daughter's story that just wasn't fully told yet. And, Allison, Kaylee's mother, was a scientist. Her stepfather, Lawrence, was a NASA engineer. So they really brought those analytical skills, their attention to detail, and a parent's relentless love.
It's really incredible how they channeled their grief into action like that. What steps did they take in their investigation?
So Allison starts by just really meticulously examining the autopsy photos, just focusing on the patterns of Kaylee's injuries. And she notices this small but distinct bruise above Kaylee's ear. It was a detail that had seemingly been overlooked before.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing how, like, one tiny little detail can become so crucial. What did they do with this new information?
Well, that's where Lawrence's expertise came in. He used 3D modeling to actually create a replica of Kaylee's head. So then they could match those injury patterns to potential objects. It was like they were putting together this really complex puzzle,
Hmm.
but with the highest possible stakes.
Wow, that's incredible. Did their investigation lead them anywhere else?
It did. They actually tracked down and bought Houghton's car, the same Mercedes that he had driven Kaylee to the hospital in. And what they found was a pretty significant breakthrough.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What did they find?
They discovered this locking knob on the passenger side door, and it perfectly aligned with that unique bruise pattern on Kaylee's head.
It's incredible how they were able to piece that all together. They were not going to let anything stop them.
No, they weren't. They were really dedicated and determined to get to the bottom of this. They even went as far as to create a video reconstruction using actors to demonstrate their theory of how Kaylee was actually injured in the car.
It sounds like they were almost building a whole new case from the ground up. So how did their investigation impact the second trial?
So their findings actually had a really profound impact on the prosecution's strategy. Now, armed with this additional evidence and a really refined approach, they decided not to call Jet to the stand this time. So they eliminated that whole, potential for the defense to exploit inconsistencies in his testimony. They also brought in a domestic violence expert to shed light on Houghton's patterns of abusive behavior, really kind of establishing this history that went beyond just that one night.
Okay, so they took Jet out of the equation. They're bringing in this expert to add context. It makes sense. Did the defense change their strategy at all?
They did. They shifted their focus to this pharmacological argument, suggesting that the high levels of MDMA in Kaylee's system could have caused the fatal brain bleed.
So they're trying to create that reasonable doubt then by focusing on the drugs that she had taken. But if the prosecution's experts had already refuted that theory, like, why would they go that route?
It's hard to say, but maybe they felt like it was their strongest option, especially since their expert witness, Dr. Anderson, wasn't called to testify in the second trial.
All right, so he was the one who suggested those alternative explanations for her injuries.
Yeah, like the complications from organ donation and that whole idea of a skull fracture from a fall.
Interesting that they chose not to use him again.
Yeah, it is.
So ultimately, the jury's left to weigh this prosecution's case. That's been bolstered by Kaylee's parents. And then this defense theory about the effects of MDMA. So after all the twists and turns, the legal battles, the efforts of her parents, what was the final verdict?
Well, the jury found Mark Houghton not guilty of murder.
Oh my gosh. I can only imagine the range of emotions that Kaylee's family and friends must have gone through hearing that. After everything they'd been through, it must have felt like such a letdown.
Yeah, it was definitely a devastating setback for them. But the story doesn't end there.
Oh, there's more.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me.
So the jury did find Houghton guilty of aggravated assault. It's a lesser charge, but still significant. and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison.
Okay, so not the complete victory that they were hoping for, but not a complete loss either.
Yeah, I guess you could say it was a very bittersweet outcome.
Absolutely, and I think this case really highlights just how complicated these domestic violence cases can be.
Yeah.
You've got this reliance on circumstantial evidence, the challenges of proving intent when the victim can't speak for themselves. It all just adds to the difficulty of getting justice.
It really does.
And, Kaylee's parents, with their scientific backgrounds, were able to bring this really unique perspective to the investigation. But it does raise some questions.
Yeah, their involvement definitely blurred the lines a bit. On the one hand, you have their actions completely driven by love for their daughter and this pursuit of justice. But on the other hand, it does make you think about the potential for bias when family members get involved.
Yeah, for sure. It makes you think about the implications for due process. It's a very tricky situation
It really is.
because you admire their dedication and the lengths that they went to,
Yeah,
but at the same time, you have to consider those ethical boundaries.
exactly.
And another element of this case that I think was really disturbing was Houghton's behavior online between the trials.
Yeah.
It seemed like he was almost taunting the justice system
Yeah.
and bragging about how he was going to get away with it.
It's really a chilling example of how social media can be used to kind of manipulate things. He was playing to this audience, trying to control the narrative.
Yeah.
It does make you wonder if that had an influence on the outcome of the second trial.
It really does. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Kaylee Mandotti case,
Yeah.
what are some of the key takeaways that you hope listeners will think about?
Well, I think it's so important to remember that domestic violence is a complex issue. This case just underscores how important it is to recognize the warning signs, to support the victims, and to advocate for change. It also shows the power of perseverance and the importance of always seeking the truth.
And as we've been talking about all this, I keep thinking about Kaylee's loved ones and the journey that they've been on. Despite all the setbacks, all the uncertainty, they never gave up hope. Their resilience is really something else.
It really is. And, I think their story is a reminder that even when you're faced with immense loss, there's strength in seeking accountability and in keeping the memory of those we've lost alive.
I think this deep dive has been really insightful. But it's clear that the conversation doesn't end here. This case brings up all these questions about the justice system, the role of social media, and the ethical considerations when victims' families get involved in investigations.
And for anyone listening who wants to dig deeper into this, there's tons of resources out there. You've got organizations that are dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence. You've got legal experts who can shed light on these complicated cases, and researchers who are studying the impact of social media on our legal system.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging with these important issues.
Mhm.
Because even though our deep dive is ending here, the conversation and the pursuit of understanding definitely continues.